Buluvinaka everyone, Buluvinaka colleagues, Buluvinaka Dr. Mesakinda Quindriketi. Today I, Rosemary Magnus, will be doing my seminar presentation for ED 456, Studies in Science Education. Before I begin, I'd like to start this presentation off with a statement that was once said by Nelson Mandela. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. Having said that, today my topic I'll be focusing on during my presentation will be language and science. Should Fiji continue to have English to be the only language in the teaching of science? Should Fiji continue to have English to be the only language in the teaching of science? During my presentation, I'll be covering the following: a brief introduction of my presentation, how English became an official language in Fiji, the effects of having to learn in the second or third language, and perceived advantage of having to learn in the mother tongue or first language or vernacular, and a summary, followed by a summary, then lastly my references. Science, through my experience, was never taught in my mother tongue or the vernacular language in Fiji. However, through literature, I found out that science in the early years was presented in different languages. It was presented in Greek, Latin. English, however, came in later. Nevertheless, according to Francis Mengubai, 1987, he stated that in Fiji, early formal education was done in vernacular. Later on, English was introduced. English was only introduced due to the rise of towns and of bureaucracy. So it is fair to say that in those early years, even though we had European educators, English educators, they had the time to learn our language in order to teach us, to make the natives understand. And a few of our elderlies who are still alive in our families would have gone through that period of learning where they were taught, everything was taught to them in the vernacular, in their first language. However, science, as we all know, is a subject taught with experiments. Experiments, experiments still needs language to be explained. Students can observe the experiment, but how will they be able to understand? Therefore, we need proper language to properly explain what is happening, what is to be done, and what are the expected outcomes of whatever we are doing for the experiment. Having said that, Taufe Ulungaki 2004 had stated that we Pacifics have always had issues of having to choose what language to use, for whom, what, and for what purpose, and even at what level. Yes, and it can be true at some point. Well, I can be teaching in an interior, rural area where they hardly understand. They have difficulties in understanding English. I cannot be teaching science to them in English. They just won't have the interest to participate in the class. However, in Fiji, as through researchers have said that English has been viewed as a language of instruction in Fiji classrooms This was mentioned by Rosiana Langi, 2016, which is true. Most of the schools in Fiji, they have made English a compulsory medium of instruction, a medium of communication. They have made English the only language to be used while within the school compound. However, in this presentation, we won't only look at the views of in Fiji, but through literatures we'll be talking about many other countries and their views on this having English be the only language of science. It varies. However, even though it varies, we all know that English has become the medium of communication across the world. Therefore, it leaves us with that question to ponder on. Should Fiji continue or remain teaching science or other subjects in English, or can we use vernacular for better understanding, or our mother tongue, or even use code switching, taking into consideration the understanding of the students? How English became an official language of learning in Fiji, and particularly science. As I've mentioned earlier, through my experience, I was never taught science in the vernacular, or even having a teacher explain to me in vernacular, or even trying to explain in vernacular of what is happening, of the experiments that are going on. As I mentioned earlier, science was taught in various languages, including English, and this was mentioned by Pozuki in 2014. And as I've said, if science was taught in those early years in various languages, why should it restrict us from having to only teach science in English when there is a possibility of us teaching it in our vernacular, in our mother tongue? Let's look at the other countries first. Tonga only taught in vernacular. Everything was taught in vernacular until modernization came in. This modernization had pushed the Kingdom of Tonga to include English in the teachings and the learning. They were taken into consideration the communications with tourists and outsiders, people from outside Tonga. And in the US, however, even though they were in the US, there were students who weren't really competent in English. However, schools admitted students to take science regardless of their English background. And teachers, however, did not take their level of understanding into consideration. All they knew was, I teach, my students are expected to understand, and they are teaching in English. So let's say we have a foreigner in the class. How will we know that that child is actually learning? Well, from what we are reading in this research conducted by Lee and Fred 2016, we are simply saying that the teachers, the educators at that while conducting their research, weren't really considerate of the fact that students, there would be some students who lack the understanding. Nevertheless, Lee and Fred also stated that students' participation is influenced by the language use. So, like I've mentioned before, using English it has its pros and cons. And having to learn in, I would say having to learn in a mother tongue would be of advantage, because the students, this is a language spoken daily by the students, this is a language they first learned. So this, having to use that language to explain science and experiments to them, I'm sure students would all be willing, would be influenced to participate, answer questions, eager to learn, because there is understanding. However, Malaysia is a bit different, in the sense that there was directive given to teach in English. Directive was given from the prime minister, and the reason he gave for having to have English to teach science and maths, he said that maths and science are not indigenous fields of knowledge to the Malaysians. That might be different for the rest of us, but for them, that's the reason why they gave. And therefore English was made compulsory to be used while having to learn maths and science. But there are some educators who actually said in Malaysia that they are considering to have slow learners learn in their mother tongue, just so that they could have better understanding of the concepts that are being taught. Similarly, in Fiji, like I've mentioned earlier, vernacular was first used in the teachings of everything. The formal education, we were only taught, our elders were taught in vernacular. And as time progressed and modernization, colonization came in, all those, English was slowly introduced. This was mainly because of the communication wise, Europeans started to come in, westernization came in. So communicating with people from outside of Fiji was mainly done in English. And since then, English has been used, and today English has dominated in Fiji, and it is, according to Maharaj 2016, it is the most widely used language out of the three languages that we have, the three common languages that we have, which are vernacular, English, and Hindi, the Indian language. Anyways, yes, nowadays hardly science lessons are taught in vernacular, or even tried to be explained in the native language. I, for one, have struggled to explain science lessons, science vocabularies in the native language, in vernacular. Through experience while teaching in the rural areas, I taught grade 1, and I had these two students of Indian descent, and these two students they only understood the local dialect. They could only understand the local dialect and the Hindi Fiji Hindi dialect language. So I struggled at the beginning explaining science to them. I had to get an Indian teacher to help me translate what I was trying to explain to them, and apart from that, I had to learn a bit of the local dialect, so that I could explain to them in the local dialect of what was going on. Moving on, we have to the effects of having to learn in the second or third language. We are particularly speaking of English. Having to learn in English can be good, as proficiency in English is essential for personal advancement as well as socio-economic development. Maharaj 2016. It can improve English literacy and competence. It helps us understand. The more we speak of the language, the more we understand it. The more we learn of the language, the more we understand it. However, learning in the second language can be difficult for those who are not competent in English. There'll be difficulties for teachers to the ability to properly explain the concept in simple English. For instance, if you take in primary school students, there are terms in the science textbooks that are a bit too advanced for the levels that you teach, and you have, as an educator, have to first understand what you are teaching so that you will be able to properly, simply explain in simple English what is it about, what experiment are you doing, or what can be the outcome of that. With that, we also have to consider those who have those who are not really good in English, those low English proficiency learners, what they need. We can't be explaining in English, fluently in English, and expect all our students to understand. There are some students who do not understand, who might not understand. As they always say, teachers always say that, it is one thing to read, and it is another thing to understand what you are reading. And there is also those who lack competence in English. We have a lot of those in Fiji. While teaching in Suva, I noticed that they can be fluent English speakers, yet they do not understand what they read, and those at times when teachers are explaining, they do not even understand. And then there's a very important one. I find this an important point: the ability for teachers to understand the difficult science term and be able to explain it to students without getting the English meaning and the science meaning mixed up, as they may vary. I was, while reading up the literatures that I had found, the one word that was given was the resistant. In physics it means a different thing, and English that means a totally different thing. So while taking science in high school, physics, my teacher did not even explain resistant. What was it? All was said was resistant. This is a resistor. But what is it? How can I explain it? How can you explain to a student that in English it means this, in science it means this? So that way the student will be able to differentiate and not come during exam time for science and writing the English meaning, which will just get them more confused, and marks can be lost for that. The perceived advantage of learning in the first language. Teaching science can be challenging for teachers as well as students who are learning it. Science is considered to be a difficult subject in school. Oyo 2015. Oyo did his research in South Africa, and he stated that students in South Africa mostly struggle in science because of the lack of understanding of the second language, which is English. Many literatures, however, that are being discussed in this presentation, those in Malaysia, Tonga, the US, South Africa, and others have actually stated that having students learn in the first language or mother tongue can be of great advantage to students. As OYO 2015 stated, students learning in their mother tongue are generally thought to have an advantage over their counterparts who are being taught in their second or third language. In Malaysia, like I've mentioned, educators have thought to teach slow learners in their mother tongue for better understanding of science concepts, year 2007. In Fiji, however, teachers have actually moved away from teaching science in vernacular or even considering code switching. They have most of the schools have focused on the use of English within the school, within the classroom, outside the classroom, among students. This is because they want students to have to improve the English competency, yet they are not considering the students' understanding of the language. Therefore, like I've mentioned, that it is not best, it would be considerate of the teachers to have to teach science using code switching, or even if so use the mother tongue, especially for those in the rural areas. Like I've mentioned earlier, that it is one thing to speak or read English, and a totally different thing to understand. It doesn't mean that you can read or speak English that you are a competent or a fluent English speaker or reader, that you understand everything in English. No, it is totally different. It is a totally different thing when we say understanding English, being competent in English. Therefore, it would be considerate of teachers or educators to actually use the mother tongue code switching while educating students in science. Then to our conclusion, teaching science in English is one of the most important change made in the education policy in Malaysia. Science is everything around us. Science can help students understand the world around them. However, science concepts can be best understood with proper and the most understandable language to the students. As OYO 2015 had mentioned, effective teaching and learning of science requires language. Science being taught in English can be both good and bad. Yet, with learners whose second language is English, like for us here in Fiji, it can be a struggle. It is very important that we give time for English, particularly in learning science and mathematics. As an educator, students in Fiji should learn science with the use of code switching, as they already lack of resources to allow the students to surf the web. Explaining the topic in the mother tongue will allow the child to imagine and process the concept. Nevertheless, students should not feel stressed with the difficult terms in science, which will discourage the child from performing, just like I've mentioned earlier. Science can be taught in both English and vernacular, but teachers need to first understand the concept before it is delivered to students. Therefore, science, if taught effectively with experiments and proper language, students can persevere and do well in science subjects in future. Having said that, I'll leave you with a quote that was said by Rosalind Franklin. Science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. Vernacular, the language that we use, is everyday. English being a foreign language that teachers are now at times forcing students to use can affect the students mentally and academically. Therefore, teachers should be considerate of the language that we use, particularly in teaching science. And now we have the reference. Those are all those references that were cited in my presentation. And thank you very much for listening. Vinaka.